All right, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining Ku-ring-gai Council webinar today with Jayden Walsh. And he is going to be talking about, well, you can see it on the screen, the Sydney's Wildlife Secrets, a search for rare and threatened fauna. You're in for a real treat today. Jayden is an absolute star. He has been interested in wildlife from a very early age. And in his, even at primary school, he was devouring nature books. And what really got him started on the wildlife was walking through the Warriewood wetlands. Is that right, Jayden? Warriewood wetlands.
Yep.
And seeing all the fabulous diversity there, the biodiversity of birds and animals, and just, you know, it really got him inspired. Eventually studying, he's studying at a Bachelor of Biodiversity and Conservation at Macquarie Uni. He's working as an ecologist for a number of different companies and has recently set up his own business. He is an ecologist. He does studies all around Sydney, Mount Kosciuszko National Park, Central Coast, and he is a fabulous, fabulous photographer. And all the images you see in this presentation are yours, Jayden, is that right?
Yep.
Yeah, and you're going to love these. These are beautiful images. So he, he's absolutely passionate about researching and documenting rare and threatened species, and this is what he is going to be talking about. So without any further ado, I might hand it over to Jayden, but just a little housekeeping, just to say, guys, if you have any questions, we'd love to hear from you. The presentation is about 20 minutes long. We'll just see how that goes. We've got plenty of time. If you've got questions, would you please direct them to the Q&A button, little icon down on the bottom of your screen there. And what we'll do is, we won't interrupt Jayden as he's going, but at the end of his presentation, I'll hop back on and we'll run through the Q&As, and there'll be plenty of time for those afterwards. And if you still want to ask more questions, you can direct them to Jayden later. He will be putting up his email address for you. So if we'd like to get started, I will just hop off and over to you, Jayden. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lindy. So, good morning, everyone. I'm going to be giving, as Lindy was saying, a brief talk about some from 20 years on. Just very briefly, I work as an ecologist, also in environmental education. So I've given quite a few presentations over the last sort of 4 or 5 years, and also been leading some wildlife tours, so taking people out to see some of the amazing wildlife that we do have. And when I'm not, working out in nature, I'm spending my time researching and documenting and going looking for some of these animals that I'll be talking about in my presentation today. Yes. So before I focus in on some of the rare wildlife of Sydney, I thought there's a few animals within Australia that are worth mentioning. And these are a few of them that I've been lucky to photograph in the last sort of year or two. And so going around from the top left, we have the armoured mist frog. This is actually a species that was thought to be extinct. And it's found up in the wet tropics, so around Cairns and a little bit north of Cairns. It was actually rediscovered about just over 10 years ago now from one small population, and there'd be less than 50 individuals left in the entire world just from this one section of river. Then on the top right is a bird that some of you might have heard of before. It's the orange-bellied parrot. And at a point in time, sort of just 2 years ago really, there were only 20 individuals left, and thanks to some captive breeding efforts, the numbers have slightly increased now, and they're well known for being only one of 2 parrots to migrate across water, and the other being the swift parrot, which is also critically endangered, and they both fly from Tasmania across to the mainland of Australia, mostly around Victoria, but swift parrots and sometimes orange-bellieds come up into New South Wales as well. And then along the bottom left, we have a Lumholtz tree kangaroo, also from Cairns, which is quite a rare animal and again, limited range. A jumping spider, actually a peacock jumping spider, down in the bottom middle, of which there's new species being discovered every week. And then the bottom right is a dragon, which was only discovered about 10 years ago now from far western New South Wales, where it's known from one gorge and one very small mountain range. And yeah, just 2 spots in the entire world for that barrier range dragon. Now, I'm going to give a few stories, but one thing to keep in mind is this quote here. And this quote is from a book which was sort of the end result of putting all these very intelligent people together for a year. And their one job was to produce this book. And so you had people from all sorts of disciplines. You had ecologists and psychologists and even economists all working to create this book that challenges the way we think about nature. So I'll give some stories, but these stories are from my viewpoint, and that's something to keep in mind as well when thinking about rare and threatened animals. A lot of these animals are very difficult to find, but these animals still exist even if we haven't found them. And the final thing before I talk very specifically about a few species is to think about why these rare animals are rare and also why they occur in certain areas but not others. And there are many people who are much more knowledgeable in geology than I am, but I've sort of gotten interested in it quite recently. And so the geology of an area, so the rocks and the soil and everything, and the topography of the area as well, so what aspect and what way is it facing and how steep is it, influences the plants that you get in the area. And so that then forms a vegetation community. So all those different plants also then influence what fauna you get in an area. So if you look, throughout Sydney, there's a few different major groups of soil and rock types. And so they influence the type of fauna that we get. So on these narrabeen group soils, you get animals which are endemic to Sydney, which I'll be talking about today, and then fauna which we typically associate with northern New South Wales on the more enriched soils. And then you've got your Hawkesbury sandstones, and there's a lot of that out towards the Blue Mountains. And again, they're really good for those animals which have adapted and evolved for the sandstone escarpments and things like that. And then the final group of soils is the Wianamata group, and that's got fauna typically that you'll find west of the Great Dividing Range. But unfortunately, a lot of it has disappeared due to development over the past sort of 50 years. And I often get asked a question at the end of my presentations, you know, where is somewhere you'd recommend to go to see wildlife? And these locations down the bottom will give you a good covering of all different soil types, and so therefore different habitat and fauna types. And so they're all sort of scattered throughout Sydney. And some of them are up in the northern half of Sydney. And then, for example, Lady Carrington Drive is a brilliant spot for lots of rainforest species down in Royal National Park. But without further ado, I will begin talking about some of these animals which are really special to Sydney. And the first one I'd like to speak about is the broad-headed snake. Now, this is one of those animals which is only found in areas associated with sandstone. And so this species is restricted sort of between the Central Coast down to Nowra, in that big areas of sandstone escarpments. Now, because most of their distribution co-aligns with where Sydney is and where Newcastle and Wollongong are, a lot of their habitat has been highly modified or destroyed, which is a real shame. but the largest threat that the broad-headed snake has faced after that fact is from about the 1960s onwards, the collection of bush rock for gardens became quite popular. And if you have a look at most gardens, really, from suburbs that were established, you'll notice they do have these beautiful sandstone rocks in their gardens. And what people don't realise is that these rocks were taken from areas that most of the time were national parks. And these rocks used to sit on top of large, big areas of sandstone and provide habitat for species like the broad-headed snake, even the red-crowned toadlet. Lots and lots of different animals lived around and under them. And the food, and so the prey for the broad-headed snake also lived around and under these rocks, which used to be out in the bush. And so not only has their habitat been highly modified, but yeah, they've also lost the food source from that. Now, the broad-headed snake is actually very interesting in its dietary requirements, in that it really only eats two very specific things, and that's the Lejeune velvet gecko, which is a relatively small gecko, and the other thing that it also eats is the copper-tailed skink, which is a fairly common skink once you get out into the sort of drier bushland to the north and south of Sydney. And that's it. It doesn't eat any other skinks or any other types of geckos generally. And so as a result, again, putting, all its eggs in the one basket is something that, has probably not benefited it. Yeah. Now, this species is highly venomous as well. And when it's not down amongst rocks looking for prey at night time, during winter it'll be sort of curled up somewhere, maybe under a rock or in a crevice. And then interestingly, in summer, when they're not active, so during the day, they'll be up in a tree hollow, because again, that kind of keeps them a little bit cooler on the really hot days of summer that around Sydney can get. And they are quite a well-named snake. They do have quite a broad head, but they never get to be a very long snake. So this individual in the photograph here was, about 40 to 50 centimetres, and they rarely get over 1 metre in length. So not a very big snake, but a very, very unique one and a very important one to have around Sydney. Now, this is a very beautiful frog known as the Little John's tree frog, or the heath frog. And this is another animal that is very interesting. It's got a story behind it. So there's another frog that looks very similar called the Jervis Bay tree frog, which is found not just at Jervis Bay, but sort of all the way up throughout northern New South Wales as well, basically down to the border in Victoria. Got quite a large distribution. And up until sort of the 1990s, this Little John's tree frog was thought to be that species. It was sort of overlooked and no one really knew exactly what they were. And so people would call them Jervis Bay tree frog, but it turns out they did some genetic work and lots of research into the habitat and the ecology of this species here, and they figured out it was actually a completely unique species. And so Jervis Bay tree frogs are more of a wetland specialist, sort of very large bodies of water near the coast. And Little John's tree frog is really always above 100 metres in sea level, and they live and spend all their time along these sort of rocky creeks, particularly throughout the sandstone country. So these ones occur from the central coast right down into Victoria, but just the very northern limit of Victoria. And they're very different. So most people think, what are two things that frogs need? Rain and heat. Well, that's true most of the time, but there always are exceptions, particularly within Australia's very interesting climate. And so the Little John's tree frog is actually active in winter on some of the coldest nights of the year. It still does require a decent amount of rainfall to get active, and then the males will call to look for a mate. But for example, when I took this photo here about 2 months ago, it was about maybe 4 degrees or 5 degrees that night. And they're the conditions that they really love. About a month ago, I got the most I've ever seen in a single night. And again, it was about 4 degrees or 5 degrees. And yeah, very, very cold. And again, like the broad-headed snake, this is a vulnerable species. And a lot of its habitat down on the south coast got burnt out in the 2019-2020 bushfires that we had recently, which is a real shame. No one really knows how they fared from that. Sort of only time will tell. But I hope that, you know, they've persisted and they found a really deep crack amongst, you know, a rock and along a river or something like that, and they have survived. But yeah, we just don't know how a lot of the population's fared yet. And this is an animal which is a lot of people's favourite. It's a very cute eastern pygmy possum. And this is one that I photographed not long ago up in Ku-ring-gai National Park. You know, they look somewhat similar to a mouse almost in size. You know, they're not very big at all, but they are part of the pygmy possum family, of which there's a couple of species within Australia. Within Sydney, though, we only get the eastern pygmy possum, and again, they are listed as a vulnerable species, so meaning that they're at risk of becoming extinct if the threats that face them, you know, aren't stopped. And again, like the broad-headed snake, a lot of their distribution within New South Wales falls within, you know, areas of the cities. So a lot of the heathland and woodland around Sydney, and no doubt where Sydney is now. Historically, they would have been all throughout. But you can still find them in, you know, pretty good numbers up in Ku-ring-gai National Park and even in Garigal National Park. But there are species which is quite difficult to find. So historically, they were thought to be absent from a lot of areas or in very, very low numbers. And people had a lot of trouble finding them. But, you know, in the last sort of 10 years, there's been, or maybe 15 years, there's been a few discoveries of good ways to find them and, you know, complete better sort of surveys for them that are more accurate. And since then, thankfully, they've turned up in a few more areas and starting to see better numbers. And from my experience, I find, you know, if you do want to see an eastern pygmy possum, the best time of year would be around February. Now, that's because Banksia serratas are flowering quite heavily in February, and not many other species of wildflower or eucalypt are flowering at that time of year. And so eastern pygmy possums really heavily rely upon that one species of Banksia at that time of year. And so if you know, are wandering around at night with a torch, you'll find that that's your best way, because at most of the other times of year, you know, they've got up to 10 or 20 different options for what they can feed on. Perhaps my most interesting encounter with eastern pygmy possums, or I actually share two very interesting encounters I had with them. One night I was down by a creek looking for a few different frog species, and I saw this little bit of movement in the water in the creek, and I got my torch onto it, and it was actually an eastern pygmy possum swimming across this creek. And so it had obviously decided there were no trees, you know, touching, and so it couldn't just run across the top. It had to come down onto the ground and actually swim across. And so that was the first record of an eastern pygmy possum swimming, and something that I highly doubt I'll ever see again, really. Very bizarre. And another interesting thing I had was maybe 4 years ago now. I was volunteering with National Parks and Wildlife at the time, and we were going out to set up some camera traps, and we were bush bashing through this quite thick heathland, and I spotted this nest just in the tree next to us. I thought, I wonder, if there's anything in it. And I looked, and I was sort of expecting to see nothing, or maybe a bird egg, in which case I'd leave very quickly. And the eastern pygmy possum actually curled up asleep in this old bird nest, relatively out in the open and exposed. And typically during the day they'll be in a tree hollow, but also use the old nests of birds if that opportunity arises. Very interesting. That talk about, which is another very rare and very threatened species, is the Australian masked owl. These look quite similar to barn owls, but they're different in a few ways. So often they're quite a little bit bigger than a barn owl. They've got much larger and stronger and feathered legs. And then there's also 3 different colour morphs with Australian masked owls. And so these 2 here are the sort of intermediate colour morph. But you can also get, the adult female, so here you've got the adult male on the right and a young bird on the left. The adult female in this pair is a very, very sort of chocolatey brown bird, and quite a bit bigger than the male. So female masked owls are, maybe up to 20-30% bigger than the males. And there's also a very light, almost completely white colour form of this bird as well. And a lot of studies have been done on this bird, and it's been found that they are the rarest owl in Australia, and they are occurring at much lower densities than a lot of other owls. And they're just generally very hard to find because they do have such large home ranges. So one pair of many different areas within that territory, so they will use most of the area. And in the non-breeding season, they'll extend that foraging area as well. So we're talking about a massive area. And then another interesting thing that I've found, and it was confirmed by a radio tracking study that was done, is that they actually sort of follow a route each night, and they'll land in one tree, wait there for 5 minutes, and then they know the next tree that they're going to go to look for prey. And so I've found that on the first quarter moon of each month, there's a particular tree that I can go and wait at, and one or both of the birds will generally turn up in that tree or that general area. But at other times of the month, they're absent from that part of their territory. So it's very interesting that the moon phase seems to influence where they go, and that is likely the case for a lot of animals, that the moon phase does influence their behaviour. And generally, these owls like the ecotone of different habitats. So where one habitat type meets the other, that's their sort of favourite area, because it means they get to sample the food from both different habitat types. So, if they've got some rainforest species that they can feed upon, so, maybe some dusky antechinus or some long-nosed bandicoots, and then if they've got heathland next to that, they might, go for bush rats and southern brown bandicoots, for example. So they get more opportunities to get prey with more different habitats. And like the rest of the owls in this genus, so like the sooty owl and the barn owl, these guys do like to roost in tree hollows, but they also can roost in caves and overhangs. So very interesting bird, and again, vulnerable, and one that's taken me a while to find, but luckily I've got onto a few different pairs throughout northern Sydney. So it's very good that they are persisting through northern Sydney, and they're actually, some individuals are using the ecotone of sort of farmland or where people have their horses, and that ecotone between slightly urban and bushland, and they'll eat things like black rats and rabbits as well. So, you know, when given an opportunity, nature can adapt if there's the right sort of structure and similarities between what they would naturally eat or what they would naturally use to sleep in, things like that. If there is a similar alternative, a lot of the time they will take it. Now, finally, I could have talked about, you know, almost 100 different rare and threatened animals. So I've just sort of scraped the surface, and there is so much left to discover. Just this week alone, a lot of genetic work and some looking at skeletons, and has revealed that the sugar glider is actually 3 different species. And so, you know, there are so many discoveries left to make in that regard, and our knowledge of wildlife is always changing. And like I said at the beginning, it is our knowledge and our viewpoint upon all this that is changing. I would really encourage you all to get out into a national park or a nature reserve or even your local bushland reserve and just see what you can find. You know, this year I've done a few trips around New South Wales, and I've just really begun to realise just how massive it is. Each little area could be holding, you know, a new species or a new area for that species, or an animal doing something different that they don't do elsewhere. And, you know, it is very exciting just to think that there are these still opportunities out there, and to make a positive difference to record that and document it. And so our knowledge is improved so that we can manage things better. Finally, if, you know, looking at these sorts of animals and just learning more is something that does interest you, which I hope it does, I've put down, there's a few different groups which I'm a member of, and they're all very, very worthwhile joining. A lot of them have field trips as well. And so if you are interested in learning more about the wild,
Okay, sorry, Jayden. I
yeah.
might have missed a bit there because I lost my connection for a while. So
Okay.
sorry.
And I froze. So I'm not sure where people heard up to, but hopefully they got everything.
Okay. Well, that was fantastic. Thank you very much. Now, yes, I hope they did, and I think that the questions will be coming. Some other people lost their connection too, so I think we're all having a little bit of problems with our internet this morning. I'll just hop back on to. We'll leave this slide up, and thank you so much, Jayden. That was absolutely fantastic. I hope everybody else enjoyed that as much as I did. I think the interesting thing that came across, I just was writing notes as I was coming down, is how critical habitat is. I mean, if you don't have the habitat, you're not going to have the creatures, are you? And a reoccurring feature that we all know about, but it really came home to me very much at this presentation, was tree hollows. How critical they are for so many different species. I mean, the broad-headed snake for resting in the eastern pygmy possum, the owls, everything needs tree hollows, isn't it? And that's what we're losing. So, it's, yeah. But look, I'm going to just ask you a few questions. So one of the first things that popped up, Jayden, was from Rose, who wanted to know about the wildlife tours. Apparently you're doing some wildlife tours. Is that right? Please advise contactees for wildlife tours.
Yeah, so I lead tours for a few different groups. Some of the groups that I mentioned at the end, obviously because of the situation we're in at the moment, I don't have any coming up in the immediate future. But I'll put my email up at the end, and if you email me, I'll be able to let you know when I have more coming up. But yeah, I don't know when that's going to be, but generally I lead more tours throughout spring and summer when a lot more animals are active. Yeah.
That's great. And you're going to put your email address up shortly, aren't you? So people can contact you directly about that, I think, which would be good. Okay, so interestingly, I thought this too, that the frog, that's a beautiful photo of that frog that you've got. And Lucinda actually asked whether it was sitting on rosemary or a native shrub. I'm thinking it was a native shrub, but maybe you'd like to tell us what it was actually sitting on.
Yeah, it was sitting on a native shrub, but it's funny say that, because when I looked at the photo, when I got home after I took it, I thought, oh, that looks an awful lot like rosemary, but it was actually a kind of banksia.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Now, somebody's asked if they could send you the photos if they come across something interesting. I guess you'd be happy to, and certainly here at Ku-ring-gai, we'd be happy if you saw something in Ku-ring-gai. We'd love to be able to put it on our register too. Or you want to talk about the atlas, the living atlas? Jayden?
Yeah. So you don't quite know what it is, I'll be happy to help out in that regard. And then there are also a few different websites where you can report the wildlife that you find. So the Atlas of Living Australia is a very good one. So it brings out so many different things, not just animals, basically anything that's living. So there's lots of plant records and, fungus and all sorts of things. And so that's a really good resource. Also, it's got a few cool features, so you can explore your area in terms of the animals that you could see in your area. So you can put your address in, or even just your general suburb, whatever. And it'll bring up a list of animals and plants and everything that's ever been seen and recorded in your area.
Yeah, that's a fantastic thing to have, isn't it? Can you just these two images that are up on the screen at the moment, Jayden? What is the frog and the skink here?
Okay, so the frog is called a Marnie's toadlet, and it was a species which was only discovered about 10 years ago, and it's found from sort of up near Foster down to the Central Coast. And yeah, it was only described and given a name about maybe 2 or 3 years ago now. And so I photographed this one from the most southern population down at the Central Coast. And it's not a very big frog, it's always hard to tell size from photos, but it's about, 2 to 3 centimetres. And again, it sort of calls and is active in an extended period of time, but also on some cooler nights. So it's a very, very cool frog, and I think it's the newest frog in Australia. And then on the right is called a mainland she-oak skink, and they're a relatively rare or hard to find skink throughout most of their range. They're sort of closely related to blue tongues. They sort of look a little bit like a smaller blue tongue, and you used to get them down at Botany, where, near the airport and the East Lakes golf course. Before that was all developed, there was a really big wetland called the Botany Swamps, and it was there along with tiger snakes and all sorts of interesting animals. Now it's not really known from Sydney. There's a few populations which seem to have crashed, but you still can get them in up around Newcastle and up in the Blue Mountains.
Yeah, it's amazing. And very specific. And I mean, a few people have said, it's incredible that the zones are so specific, and that's what you were sort of alluding to too, when you were saying you can get out there and you can discover stuff. There's so much we don't know. There's so much more to discover. Because these very specific zones. So thanks, Gay, for that one. And Mark was asking about rock warblers on Sydney sandstone. Have you seen rock warblers around Sydney sandstone?
Yes. They're, again, an animal that I'd like to mention if I'd, had 10 days to talk to you. But yeah, rock warblers are the only endemic bird in New South Wales. So that means they're the only bird only found in New South Wales. And again, like the broad-headed snake and red-crowned toadlets, they're restricted to that sandstone from just south of Newcastle and again down to about Nowra. And they're quite an interesting bird, and they sort of hop along sandstone escarpments all day, picking at bugs and invertebrates and things like that. So they work their way all along the sandstone, and then their nest is actually sort of in a cave or an overhang, and it's a hanging basket like you'd sort of expect from a weaver or some bird like that. And so, yeah, they nest in sort of complete darkness, and you can still get them throughout Ku-ring-gai Chase National Park, and Royal National Park is good for them as well, and all through the Blue Mountains, but they don't cope very well with urbanisation. So within some of the slightly smaller, more central national parks, so like Glen Cove National Park, rock warblers seem to have disappeared, and that might also have to do with the increase in pied currawong numbers, and they'd predate the nests and eggs.
It's a shame.
They're an amazing bird, and they're one that a lot of bird watchers come to Sydney just to see rock warblers. And I also found a roost site for a rock warbler, which makes sense, but it was also in a sort of cave overhang. And it seems that they have favoured roost sites because I've seen it there a few times. And from what I can find, it's possibly the first roost site recorded, which was exciting.
Yeah, that's incredible. Actually, speaking of those roost sites and overhangs, is it because they become quite weedy? When you go out in the bush, sometimes you see them completely covered up. It's actually worth targeting those sites to clear off some of the weeds from the overhangs. Would that make a difference, or do they actually like the privacy of a weedy overhang?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I've found quite a few rock warblers, and they've never had vegetation nearby, so it seems that they're not too fussed. But in terms of a lot of other species, like the broad-headed snake, one thing that they are doing to help them is small hazard reduction burns around the rock shelves to remove that leaf litter. Because when you have leaf litter, it changes the thermal properties of the rocks. And so that is actually a management action that they're doing for them. And it probably would benefit other things as well. So I'd say it probably would benefit rock warblers as well.
That's really interesting. We are so fortunate here in Sydney, aren't we? Janetta Russell has said that she lives next door to the National Park at North Turramurra, and she's on the edge of a cliff, a steep escarpment, and on the boundary, she's got a very large old man banksia. And she's wondering whether it's worth her while to put up a pygmy possum box with a camera in it, or a camera on it, I suppose. And could you comment on the fascinating breeding habits of the pygmy possum?
Yes, so I think it would be worth putting up a nest box if you are, that close to the national park. There have been, from what I understand, pygmy possums, sort of on the very edge and even in some people's backyards before. And I know Ku-ring-gai Council does a lot of good work with eastern pygmy possums, so it's probably worth getting in contact with them as well. And yeah, I mean, it's just fantastic that you do have a great big old man banksia there as well, because, like I was saying, that is a very important food source for them. So I think, it definitely would be worthwhile.
What about, I think do you know much about the breeding habits of the pygmy possum? It was a particular question that.
Not a lot specifically, no.
Okay, well, that's something maybe the genetic, maybe you could research that and let us know.
Yeah, okay. I can't say I do. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, no, that's all right. So Jayden touched on the fact that Ku-ring-gai Council have an Eastern pygmy possum monitoring program. So if you would like some more information about that, if you could send us an email and we can let you know what we do with that. There's volunteers that go out and monitor nest boxes. And speaking of that, Chelsea Costello is the person who coordinates that, and she has said, "Great talk, Jayden," which it was fantastic. Thank you very much. And she also asked if there's been any news on the swift parrot movements on the mainland this winter, following the bushfires, particularly. Yeah. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, very good question, because it's been a very interesting year. So typically within New South Wales, you'll have, swift parrots turning up sort of late April, early May, and they'll keep turning up until sort of by late June. Most of them should have arrived at where they're going to stay for winter. And typically you'll have a few flocks within Sydney and a few flocks, particularly around the Cessnock area. So Cessnock can sometimes have up to 100 birds in an area, and same with Sydney. This year, I saw sort of 4 individuals quite early on in the season, just one at a time, over the course of maybe a week. One even flew over my house. And then sort of nothing, and there have been no reports for most of New South Wales, which was concerning, definitely. And no one knows exactly why. It could be that the majority of the birds are down in Victoria, because they, a lot of them do overwinter in Victoria. So that could be the case. About a week ago, a flock of about 20 was found near Cessnock. But yeah, it's very strange, and it seems that the fires that happened recently did have an effect on them, and maybe has sort of made them reluctant to travel further north, because once they get to, just over the sort of Victorian border, they'd be confronted with, a lot of burnt out habitat with probably not a lot to eat. And I suspect that probably has a lot to do with that. Hopefully, next year and the year after, as things begin to regenerate, they will return again to Sydney and areas further north, because there are still some areas of, unburnt habitat with good flowering available. But yeah, I guess it does sort of highlight that wildlife corridors do work, because when they're not there, you notice the absence of the species.
Very important, those wildlife corridors, yeah. Lucinda Coates asks about powerful owls, and apart from trying to ensure that no more hollow-bearing trees are cut down, which is, a difficult thing for us to do, but is there anything else that people can do to help powerful owls?
Yeah, well, as I'm sure most of you know, there's the Powerful Owl Project. So there's a monitoring program. And I think the important thing of that is to understand them a little bit better. And that's why it was sort of set up, to understand, because the things that the urban powerful owls are doing can be quite different to what you would find in areas that a lot of study had been done down near Eden on them, but the situation there is very different. There's a lot more forests. And so that is one way, getting involved in that and actually monitoring a pair and seeing if they're successful, and then if they're, and if they're not, then what's the problem? Is there disturbance from, dogs or foxes and things like that? And so fox control and, keeping pets inside is also very important. A lot of young powerful owls do get predated by feral species or attacked. So, yeah, there are a few things, but yeah, obviously hollow-bearing trees. Interestingly, within Sydney, the proliferation of ringtail possums and brush-tailed possums, and then a few urban camps of grey-headed flying foxes, which are certainly, not as common as they should be. That sort of meant that powerful owls do have quite a variety of prey to choose from in certain areas. If you've ever been through like Lane Cove National Park at night, the number of ringtail possums is phenomenal. And so it's sort of good at least that they have help in terms of an abundance of prey, which will hopefully even out the effect of, the loss of hollow-bearing trees. But yeah.
Mm. Well, I suppose that if they've got enough to eat, but they've got nowhere to
live,
nowhere to live. That's
kids, yeah.
Yeah, does that mean that they extend their territory, or?
Yeah, or they move into more urban areas and would, maybe be less picky in the types of hollows that they use. And like maybe a few years ago, one was recorded even nesting in a termite mound, which was the first record of that. And so it's interesting, they'll find ways or try to find ways if, there aren't tree hollows, but they are sort of more reluctant to use nest boxes as well. So it is a difficult situation.
It is difficult because they need such a big space, don't they?
Yeah.
Also, I didn't actually ask all of Elsa's questions because the very first slide, Jayden, when you introduce yourself, you're lying down on the ground looking at a snake. What's the snake you're looking at?
It's a Highland copperhead.
Okay, you're not putting yourself in harm's way there, are you? It's not a venomous one.
Well, it is venomous, but I'm not putting myself in harm's way.
Excellent. There you go, Elsa. It's what did you say, copperhead?
Yeah, Highland copperhead.
Highland copperhead. Thank you very much. Well, Janetta's come back. Apparently she knew about pygmy possums. Maybe she just wanted you to say it rather than her. Okay. They're very promiscuous apparently, and they only stay with their partner for 1 or 2 days and then they move on. So there you go, pygmy possums. Yeah.
Who'd have thought?
Who'd have thought? That's right. Okay, somebody was asking about the recordings, but I think that might have been answered. They will be put up on the website. There'll be a dedicated area on the website for all the webinars, and so apologies if they're not all up already. That we've had a couple of bee ones and one on the Herbaceae spinantha, and this one they'll all be up. If they're not up already, they'll be up very soon. Carolyn, to record sightings and species for your address.
Sorry, Lindy. So Carolyn was just asking where she could get the website to record sightings and to get species.
Okay, well, that would be the Atlas, the Living Atlas, yeah.
Yeah, so if you search Atlas of Living Australia, that will direct you to that webpage, and there's a few different options once you're there.
Yeah. Hopefully that's it. But yeah, if you just put that into your search engine, Atlas of Living Australia, isn't it? Yeah, you'll find it. Okay, well, I think that's it. That's all the questions, and that was fantastic. Thank you, Jayden. We really enjoyed that. I don't think there's. Oh, yeah, thank you very much. We've got lots of thank yous, which is good. And once again, just to let you know that they will be the presentation will be up on the website, so you'll be able to look at it. And you want to have a look at you want to put the next slide up, Jayden, because that's got your email address.
Yes, so if you do have any other questions that you think of later or just general wildlife questions, you can feel free to send me an email. And yeah, that's my email address there.
Great, thanks very much. Okay, thank you everybody. I don't think there's any more questions now. No. So we'll be, I mean, if you want to hang around for a bit, we'll still be on air, but this is the end of the presentation, and so we'll stop recording now. And thank you very much for attending today. It was great to have so many of you on board. Thanks a lot, Jayden.
Thank you, Lindy.